Seam finish. So now that you know all about seams, you would have noticed that the plain seams have raw, messy edges. This is neither aesthetically appealing, nor does it prevent the seam from unraveling. So there are techniques called seam finish that can be applied to these raw edges to protect it from raveling and to give it a neat finish. In this class, you will learn all about seam finish. Objectives: at the end of this class, you will be able to describe a seam finish, determine the criteria for the selection of seam finish, explain the different seam finish techniques. So, a Hong Kong seam finish. What is a seam finish? A seam finish is a treatment that secures and neatens the raw edges of a plain seam. Seam finish is given to the seam edge to prevent the fabric from fraying and raveling. It also provides a neat look. Now let's see the criteria based on which seam finish is selected. The criteria for the selection of seam finish. The type of seam finish chosen depends on the type of fabric, its weight, its weave, etc., and wear and tear of a garment. It is not required in lined garments. If it is lightweight fabric, then one would use a French seam, overlock, overcast, pinking, self-bound. If it is medium-weight fabric, like shirt material, then one would use a flat fell seam, overlock, overcast, pinking, self-bound, and bias-bound or Hong Kong finish. If it is heavy-weight fabric like jeans, one would use a flat fell seam, overlock, overcast, Hong Kong, or bias-bound. Now let's see the different seam finish techniques. Seam finish techniques. Seam finish can be achieved by one of the following techniques: sewing over the raw edges, trimming the raw edges, self-enclose the seam allowance, enclosing the raw edges in some sort of binding. Let's see each one in detail. The first method of seam finish is sewing over the raw edges. This can be done in a variety of ways, by overcasting, overlocking, etc. For example, the seam allowances of plain seams can be trimmed and stitched together with an overlock stitch using 3 threads or 5 threads overlock machine. Plain seams may also be pressed open, and each seam allowance can be separately secured with an overlock stitch. Traditional home sewing techniques for finishing plain seams include oversewing and hand-over casting. The second method of seam finish is trimming the raw edges. Some seam finish is given on the edge of the seam allowance, like pinking. Trimming with pinking shears is a traditional home sewing technique for finishing plain seams. The third method of seam finish is self-enclose the seam allowance. The other method is to enclose the seam allowance so that it is not visible anymore, like in French seam, self-bound seam, flat-felled seam. For enclosed seams, more seam allowance is required. This seam finish is suitable in straight seams and in light to medium weight fabrics. Trimming and pressing are important steps in finishing enclosed seams. The fourth method of seam finish is achieved by binding. A bound seam has each of the raw edges of its seam allowances enclosed in a strip of fabric that has been folded in half lengthwise. An example of binding is double fold bias strip. The binding's fold is wrapped around the raw edge of the seam allowance and is stitched through all thicknesses, catching underside of binding in stitching. Bound seams are often used on lightweight fabrics including silk and chiffon, and on unlined garments to produce a neat finish. Then there is the Hong Kong seam. A Hong Kong seam is a home sewing term for a type of bound seam in which each raw edge of the seam allowance is separately encased in a fabric binding. The binding is usually a bias cut strip of lightweight lining fabric, so it is also called the bias bound seam. Let's see how to do Hong Kong finish. The procedure of sewing the Hong Kong finish. Step 1. Measure and cut fabric strip. For a Hong Kong finish, measure a bias strip of fabric to the width of the seam allowance plus 1/4 inch. Then cut this strip of fabric. Step 2. Fold and pin fabric piece to the seam allowance. Fold it in half and iron it. Place the bias strip on top of the seam allowance, right sides together, and pin it. Step 3. Stitch the fabric piece to the seam allowance. Then stitch it 1/8 inch from raw edges. Fold the bias strip over the raw edge and around to the underside and stitch in place. Step 4. Repeat the same procedure on the second side of the seam allowance. The seam with the Hong Kong finish is ready. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. A seam finish is a treatment that secures and neatens the raw edges of a plain seam. The type of seam finish chosen depends on the type of fabric, its weight, its weave, etc., and wear and tear of a garment. It is not required in lined garments. Seam finish can be achieved by one of the following techniques: sewing over the raw edges, for example, overcast or overlock, trimming the raw edges with a pinking shears, self-enclosing the seam allowance, for example, French seam, self-bound seam, and flat fell seam, enclosing the raw edges in some sort of binding, for example, the bound seam and the Hong Kong seam. The procedure of sewing the Hong Kong finish. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure and cut fabric strip. Step 2. Fold and pin fabric piece to the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the fabric piece to the seam allowance. Step 4. Repeat the same procedure on the second side of the seam allowance. This is the Hong Kong seam finish. Hope now you will be able to apply the newly learned knowledge of seam finish in the making of garments.